Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, CI and CD for Oracle, Apex, and Friends. My name is Rebecca Pruce, and I'll be your moderator today. I work on the marketing team here at FlexDeploy, and I'm really excited to be hosting this session today. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dan Gert. Dan is our president at FlexDeploy and has presented countless webinars and sessions, and today he's going to share how to bring continuous integration and continuous delivery practices to Oracle, Apex, and its friends. Before I hand things over to Dan, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, a recorded version of this webinar will be available and will be sent directly to you within the next day. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you have a question for our speaker, please feel free to send it through the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your player or by tweeting us at GoFlexagon. We'll be answering questions at the end of the session today. If we don't get to your question during this webinar, we'll be sure to follow up with you after. Finally, we do have past webinar recordings available on our YouTube channel, and we have an exciting lineup of webinars coming up in the second half of the year. Keep your eye out for details on registering, and feel free to share any topics that are of interest to you. So without further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming Dan Gert. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Great to be here today. It looks like a really big crew of people attending. It's interesting, we were at K-Scope, the OD-TUG conference here a few weeks ago, and one of the focus areas was Apex, not surprisingly at that particular that particular conference. So a lot of excitement out there for many technologies in this space that we play in around DevOps, CI/CD, and release orchestration, in part because, as this slide alludes to, the challenges never end. Right, we're trying to go faster, better, cheaper, and that's up and down the stack, whether we're focused on infrastructure provisioning and configuration management, database proper or database-related technologies such as Apex, middleware apps, up and down the entire technology stack, including on-prem and, of course, the cloud, as many enterprises adopt cloud strategies, multi-vendor cloud strategies, and the like. And then very importantly, it's not only when we adopt new technologies for a new implementation, but we upgrade our technologies and our tools over time. We have ongoing maintenance and such. And so the key is we as IT people, whether you are an end customer, a partner, while you're trying to use the technology to solve business problems as effectively as possible, it is a challenge. And so we're getting after that to basically deal with a number of different dimensions: cost, speed, quality. We're not going to peel through this in any level of detail, but whether you're a developer, a database administrator, somebody in release management, or a leader, architect, or executive, we all have to deal with these costs and the challenges of being a little too slow and costly at times, not to mention always wanting to focus on the quality and the risk dimensions. So over time, we need to focus on an entire spectrum, both technologies we're using today. So with this set of continua, you have more traditional on the right, so traditional process like waterfall, traditional, I would say more or less frequent delivery, more monolithic and on-prem type of solutions or technology architectures. And on the very far end of the spectrum to the right is new architectures, right? More agile processes, things like microservices and containers or heavy cloud, many things that ultimately are trying to help improve how we deliver value to our businesses. And the challenge is, how do we adopt new technologies while also working with existing technologies that are doing a very nice job for us. And so to that end, there's been a lot of drivers over the past few years that are getting at this both at a process and a technology level. You're hearing more about Agile, and I would say many of you are adopting Agile processes and being, breaking problems down into smaller chunks and delivering them through their life cycle much more rapidly. And then along the way, adopting things like continuous integration or continuous delivery, the broader DevOps or release automation, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud. It's in many cases anchored in automation as a means, or at least one element of being able to provide that additional business value. And so it looks like my screen is locked up here. So if you bear with me for a minute. There we go. The key here is that there are 3 anchoring points into a DevOps platform, the core capabilities that you often hear about, one being continuous integration, the next continuous delivery, so CI, CD, as well as release orchestration. That tends to be a broader umbrella over the top of that. And so at Flexagon, for those of you who don't know anything about the product, FlexDeploy, our DevOps platform, there's a few things to really consider in terms of what the solution is all about. And a few of those things include the ability to streamline your entire tool chain, whether you're using Jira as a agile tool or many others, or whether you're using different source control systems like Git or Subversion or Perforce. And then as you cross the entire tool chain of coding and building and integrating, testing your solutions, deploying them, and ultimately releasing them into production, we also need to operate them. So there's this big life cycle that plays through here, and so we need to streamline and integrate that entire tool chain so it can be much more effective. And then sitting on top of that are 3 major features of the platform, which is build, that includes continuous integration, deployment automation, and release orchestration. So the key is, again, for those of you, and many as it looked like as you were coming into the webinar, there's a whole mixed bag, some customers existing, some not, and a mixed bag of other partners. So I'm sure you're all coming in at a different angle, but in a nutshell, that's the platform, and it really is all about having that nice and comprehensive integrated solution, yet very open and extensible. A lot of automation with controls and visibility. You'll see a lot of these plugins. Specifically, we're going to focus on Apex, and then database, ORDS, and some other related technologies that in many cases are used together for an Apex-based solution. And so to that end, let's focus a little bit more on the 3 pillars of build, deploy, and release. So in the demo that we're going to fire up here momentarily, we're going to talk about build and continuous integration. So the ability to much more iteratively and rapidly integrate with our source control systems and or directly into another source like Apex and the database, package up any number of changes and version those in an artifact repository. So we can perform that build and optionally use continuous integration via configuration so that we can rapidly pull together, build and package up whatever the changes are, okay? And then subsequently, we're going to deploy those changes into their respective runtime. Of course, with Apex and our focus area for today, that's very heavily database-centric, but that can be many other things as well up and down the technology stack at the app level, middleware level, and such. And then also, although we're not going to focus on that today, another broad category of capabilities around provisioning and configuration management. Cloud is a perfect example of that, but that also, of course, plays into on-premise solutions. And then server management for starting and stopping servers, doing other things in and around base, build, and deploy. So the third is release. So on top of building and deploying, we need to orchestrate a release. And so the release is your content. And we're going to talk about Apex and ORDS and database schema changes and SOTA and some of those sorts of things. And we're going to create releases of those and work on those together. So they have affinity, and we might have a solution that incorporates those and or other technologies, and we want to create a release out of that, and then a pipeline that basically defines the process for migrating changes or deploying changes across a series of stages or environments. So we can create snapshots of our release, flow that across the pipeline, injecting the quality along the way that we need to. And then throughout the whole platform, you'll see security, role-based security, ability to inject testing, which in many cases, as you mature your processes, becomes very important. That testing might be functional, it might be performance or load testing, It might be static code analysis. So integration with lots of tools and the ability to orchestrate that. And then the general controls and visibility that make sure that we are meeting our quality requirements, gaining approvals if they're needed, scheduling things to happen in many cases when you don't need to be around, so you can have a better work-life balance, so you can just let the systems and the tools do the work, and then visibility via forms, dashboards and reports and such. So lots of out-of-the-box capability here. Again, we're going to focus on some of the Apex and database-related plugins that come right out of the box that do the heavy lifting for you. But just note as you scan around the entire platform, there's lots of tools and technologies, some of which you might be using both to manage the front end, i.e. the JIRAs of the world, or your broader change management like a ServiceNow, not to mention many others across the entire tool chain. So given this is somewhat an Oracle-centric webinar today with Apex, and there's a chart here that shows a little bit more about what we have out of the box for other plugins. So the database and tools, we're focused on the database as a code, whether that's using the Oracle database plugin that comes with FlexDeploy or JDBC. And we have the Apex plugin, ORDS, and I don't have to enumerate all of these, but other things such as for testing UT-PL/SQL, a popular PL/SQL test tool. We're seeing more and more traction. And so that's an example where we have an integration to that. And lots of other things that are out there, and scanning across the middleware and the apps like our popular e-business suite support, or cloud, very importantly, at the infrastructure level, at the platform level, and certainly at the database level, being able to manage those cloud resources very effectively. All right, so with that said, let's turn to the Apex and Friends. And so walking through this, it's a pretty busy chart, but in essence, what this one slide does before we go to demo describes what the capabilities are for Apex and some of the related technologies. So at the core, the support for Apex is going to automate that entire deployment process. So we're going to talk about how it can do that at an application level or breaking that down at the page level. But in essence, we're going to build and we're going to package up changes and deploy them and really automate that process. So on one hand, as a developer, you can spend as much of your time that you possibly can developing. Develop. That's what provides value to the business, and that's what developers like to do, right? So less focus on the underlying tooling and how we are going to move changes across environments, more time spent developing. If you're an administrator, a DBA, or another role in that capacity, well, it'll help you be more productive because you're going to be now automating these processes at the database level for Apex, other things like that. So it's going to eliminate a lot of those manual activities and scripts, in part because of the built-in workflow and the automation that comes right out of the product. Very importantly, we enable basically to be selective on how you approach deployment. Sometimes it makes sense to deploy an entire or a full application, right? Other times you might want to break that down and pick and choose and deploy individual pages or some subset of pages associated with an application, or maybe some of the other shared components. So you have the flexibility to go ahead and approach that however you'd like. Optionally, you can integrate with source control tools. So whether you use Get, Subversion, TFS, or something else, we have deep integration with all of those. And if your process is, or you want to take an approach where you're taking your changes, whether that be Apex proper, the database, or other artifacts, and storing them into your source control system, then we can drive the build and deployment from there. Or we can optionally go directly to the Oracle database and source or export the things from that for Apex as an example, okay? Another thing is optionally continuous integration. So this webinar is CI and CD for Apex and Friends. Although many customers out there are not or haven't maybe adopted CI, that we make very easy, so that if you'd like to do that, you can do that via configuration. And we have a built-in CI server so that you can easily trigger a build and a deploy ultimately streamlining that process as a developer, okay? And then smart deployment, just another thing where we use change detection. And so rather than just redeploying everything that is out there, it does this smart deploy and is able to skip the different things, whether that's an Apex application, a page, or some shared component, so it doesn't redeploy what's already there, unless, of course, you have the ability to override that. All right, so that's some of the key capabilities of the Apex proper. At a database level, well, in many cases, we're going to be managing the structural changes or other aspects of the database. And so we have a couple options there, JDBC, a JDBC plugin, and a full Oracle database plugin that does the synchronization completely under the covers and manages all that heavy lifting, whereby JDBC, you can write your own scripts, you can commit those scripts into the source control system, and then we very nicely and seamlessly integrate that into your deployment process. So as DBAs in general, and of course the developers, as we try to adopt these more agile, DevOps and more continuous type of delivery methods, we want to make sure that we're supporting all roles, right? Not just the traditional developers, but the DBAs and others of the world. Okay, so handling that at the database level, and then a plugin for ORDS. So many customers that are using Apex also use the REST data services, and so we have an out-of-the-box plugin for that. We see some SODA for those of you that like to use SODA as a tool, and we have an out-of-the-box plugin for that as well. So then, in general, beyond core build and deploy, the full release orchestration via pipelines. We touched on that a little bit earlier, but it certainly creates a much more consistent and repeatable process for your overall release management, and allows you to call it the governance and controls, injecting those approvals and schedules and other manual tasks that you might be doing today. So streamline that entire process. And then from a visibility standpoint, making it very easy for you to be able to view changes over time, right, at the individual page or component level, and compare pages or other components across environments, so you have complete visibility to what's running where across all environments, as well as being able to use that source control management. And now you have visibility from exactly what you're doing in the source control all the way through your building and packaging across environments. And you have that for both troubleshooting and auditing purposes. So robust visibility from end to end, as well as, although I didn't mention it directly, we log information. So logging right at your fingertips. So whether you're a developer, an administrator, or what have you, if you need to troubleshoot a problem, we make that very easy to do by putting that information right at your fingertips. So with that said, that's what I was going to share. But in a nutshell, it's about automating the processes for Apex and the related technologies, so you can spend your time doing what you're better at, right? The things like developing new applications or working up the food chain and not doing the things that are more monotonous, if you will. So come up the food chain, do things that are more valuable, and so you can go faster, right? Improve the quality, improve the traceability, and ultimately provide more value to your IT team and the ultimate business. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this over to FlexDeploy. So I am signed in as an administrator. Basically, I have all access, so I don't need to be signing in and out as I switch roles. But what we'll do here over the next probably 20-25 minutes or so, we want to make sure we leave time, as Rebecca said, to be able to take some Q&A here. But what we will do is we will go ahead and walk through some of the high-level capabilities, and then drill into the details of some of the Apex and Friends, okay? So in a nutshell, for a few areas that we're not going to cover in depth are security. So there's that full role-based security model, so you can define and segregate your responsibilities, developers, admins, release managers, whatever makes sense in your particular environment. We have a topology. This is a UI, of course, at this level, where we can configure FlexDeploy so it can talk with the various tools and technologies. So whether that is something like Apex or something like eBusiness Suite or ORDS or the database directly or what have you, we are going to have this configuration information, all done up front in a one-time administrative type of setup capacity, and then we're good to go. And so I brought up a few of these Apex-related examples here. We call it NICE. I believe this guy ships, it might be an example that ships with one of the products with Apex. But in general, what it is it makes it very easy to configure each one of the environments. So in this case, the test environment for Apex with the information that it needs so that FlexDeploy can talk with this, with this Apex environment. Or similarly, if we are, if we're looking at the schema, specifically the database schema associated with this, when we're going to be making the changes for the database. Well, this exposes a lot of the database specific information that is configured one time, and then we're good to go. Okay, and then lastly, the ability to configure FlexDeploy to talk with your source control systems if you're doing source control, which, as you would guess, we strongly advise the use of source controlling everything where possible, whether that's the definition of your infrastructure, the code, the configurations, and things like this in Apex land. Okay, so we can do all of that and make that very, very easy and effective. Test tools. So if you're using UTPL SQL, as I mentioned, or if you're using many other test tools that are in the market, how do you configure FlexDeploy to do that? Right, integrate with those tools, or issue tracking like Jira, change management like ServiceNow, and then very importantly, you might be running your Apex and your databases all on-prem today. You might be or have moved some of that to the cloud, and so we make working with cloud resources very effective. And I don't, it's not a focus of today, but certainly cloud's a big deal, and we've got a lot of customers that have moved a lot of technology to the Oracle Cloud and to other clouds in a multi-cloud strategy. But wherever you happen to run your Apex and related technology, you're good to go in terms of how that would work with FlexDeploy. So with that said, there's a few things here that we're gonna look at. We're gonna focus on the Apex application and some of those friends, and we're gonna open up what we call these projects within FlexDeploy, and we're going to break these down so you can understand what they are. So in this Apex folder, we're going to talk about a few different examples for how we can automate these processes, and we're going to look at this at a project-by-project level initially. So how do we build and deploy changes for the Apex application itself? How do we do that for the ORDS-related artifacts? Or how do we do that for the other supporting objects like the database schema changes themselves, okay? And we'll break that down to bring that to life. And then we'll go up to releases and pipelines, which, as I mentioned earlier, will allow you to work with multiple of these things all together as a solution and be able to streamline that entire process for managing snapshots of releases and releases in general across your pipelines. But let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of these examples. Under full, this is what we call full automation, and it's going to be working on the full application, the Apex application. So we're going to use some of the same applications, just use a different approach because you have the ability to configure FlexDeploy to work in either capacity. So in this case, for this bug tracking project, we have to configure that, just like we have to configure every project, to either tie to a source control system or export directly from the Oracle database, because this is this Apex application, right? And so in this case, we chose to source from Git. So the use case would have the developers checking their SQL, basically the application, into Git, right? And then when we perform a build, we're going to source that from Git. Now, just so you know, we don't have time to work or look into this as part of this webinar, but there are techniques within FlexDeploy that can automate the process of automatically going out on a schedule or as frequently as you want, and basically pull the applications and everything out of the database and put that in a source control system for you, so you don't have to do that, and then drive the build process from there. So there's some really interesting techniques there that can be used. But in this case, the developers will be checking in their changes into source control. In this case, configured to Git, and then they define a workflow, build and deploy Apex. So these workflows, which we'll look at in a minute, know all about Apex and how to do the exports and the imports and those sorts of things. Okay, if we look at this second Apex application, again, it's a full application versus what I'm going to show you in a minute called partial, where we can pick and choose and go down to the page level. So we could build and deploy pages, and we'll talk about that. But in this case, the only difference between these applications is we've chosen not to use a source control system for the Apex applications. FlexDeploy is going to go reach out into the database and pull those artifacts out of there. But in this case, we've chosen not to use source control. So you have that flexibility and choice, but note that they're using the same build and deploy, the exact same workflows. So those are reusable. And they're running them on the same build instances here. Okay? With that said, those are two examples. And then I'll show you a couple others before we go to the workflows. In this particular case, I'm bringing up the bug tracking application that we're using what we call partial. And what partial is going to give us, you'll note that in this case is similar where we're using Git and the same build and deploy workflows. And if I bring up the sample projects, it's going to look very similar using none. We're sourcing directly from the Apex database, and it's going to use the same workflows. So why are we talking about this partial? So what's the difference? Well, I've alluded to a little bit, but it's basically allowing us and enabling us to break the application down and give basically the developer, whoever's using this, the ability to break it down and build and deploy at a finer grain. So you can build and deploy and select different artifacts, like in this case, some shared components, or some, in this case, pages, actual pages of your Apex application, and select a subset of the overall application, package it up, right? In this case, those files, and submit that in your build process. So now it's going to run the build workflow. It's going to package up the changes, those 6 files, and store them in the artifact repository. All right? So very importantly, it's doing all of that out under the covers. In this particular case, we were looking at something that is pulling directly from the Apex database, because there is no source control system being used, right? If we chose to go back to that same project, and because this one was sourcing, oops, I picked the wrong one. I'll just take the bug tracker here. And this one is sourced from Git directly. Then because that's set up and configured to use source control, then we can go ahead and do the same thing, but just know that in that particular case, it's going to be sourcing directly, and we're pulling these from the source control system. So again, I can go ahead and do this and pick and choose whatever I want to subset my overall list of changes that I want to do, and then I can go ahead and, in this case, you might have seen me click Force Build. I haven't changed anything in the source control system for these files, and FlexDeploy knows that and would say, hey, there's nothing to build. You haven't changed anything. All right, so in this case, I've kicked off another build for this bug tracking. What it's doing is reaching out to Git, pulling those files out of Git, running that same workflow that was used for the other one, and going to store that into the repository, right? So if I go back up here, up to the projects, and we look at that sample project that just completed its build, if I go to this execution ID, we'll go into the details and we can drill in and see that, yeah, there are those 3 shared components and the 3 pages that I was looking at. They're packaged up, they're versioned, they're stored in the FlexDeploy artifact repository as this new build 1.0.10, and then we're ready to go. All right, we can say, let's just go ahead and deploy that. And then we can pick an environment like development and put that to a schedule, or we can just go ahead and submit that immediately like we're doing now. Well, as you saw, I submitted this request and it says, oh, they're all there. So FlexDeploy has what's called smart deployment. And so we keep track of exactly what's running at a very, at an object or file level. So if something is already deployed, unless you override it, it'll skip the different things that are deployed there. So call that smart deployment, because of course you don't want to be wasting resources when that deployment is already running in that environment. Okay, so what we just did there is we just submitted a deployment. So now it's executing that deploy workflow, right, to be able to go off and take and push this Apex set of changes, not the full application because we chose to use partial here, but it's going to deploy those shared components and the pages into this development environment. And we could have done that to test or production or what have you. Okay, so there's this other concept, and I'm going to just show you this, of packages. So you, as a developer, you could say, hey, I'm in a sprint right now, or I'm in my development cycle where I'm going to be working on these 5 pages. So it's a productivity enhancer to be able to allow you to define what am I going to work on, and maybe this is what I'm going to use as a starting point, and then I want to say, hey, let me go ahead and build my 4 pages that I'm working on, and I can just submit that. And it'll go off and execute that build, package those changes up, and store them in the artifact repository. So hopefully you're getting the hang of it. You understand what these projects are, the fact that the projects, whether we are using our full application or what we call partial, it's the ability to define the projects so that FlexDeploy knows what it is, use these workflows that have out-of-the-box capability to be able to work with the specific technologies and automate those processes of building and deploying. All right, I'm going to show you another example. Here's a couple examples of supporting objects. And by supporting objects in this case, we specifically mean some of the underlying database schema changes that need to be made. And we have 2 different approaches that we can use there. One is that Oracle database plugin that comes out of the box. If you're familiar with like a Liquibase of the world, it basically does the same type of thing as Liquibase. It does full synchronization to say, hey, I've got a database, I've made these changes here to my baseline database, maybe my development environment, and now I want my QA environment to look exactly like that. And so under the covers, the Oracle database plugin that comes with FlexDeploy handles all of that and does the synchronization. We'll do things like simulation if you want ahead of time so you can see what would happen, that sort of thing. And so in this case, we can take a look at how that's configured, and you'll note that there is no source control system being used, but we're using a workflow called build DDL and synchronize DDL. Those workflows are going to use those plugins that we're talking about. Now, I haven't shown you the workflows themselves. I'm going to do that here in a minute, but this gives you an idea that if you're going to be managing database schema changes, you can do it that way as well. So I can go ahead and shut a few of these guys, open up what's called the nice JDBC, and probably not surprising at this point is that we're going to be using workflows that are leveraging our JDBC plugins to build and deploy. Now, in this case, note that we're sourcing those from the source control system, Git in this case, but you could be using, I didn't mention that, but all the other popular source control systems as well. And so at the end of the day, whether you're working on the Apex applications themselves, whether you're doing full application-based builds and deploys, whether you're doing partial and subsetting them down into the pages and other shared components, potentially working on your database schema changes that are associated with your Apex application, or things like ORDS. So if you're using the REST data services and you want to automate the build and deployment of those, well, it's the same type of process, right? So in this case, we go ahead and we have a build workflow and a deploy workflow that knows under the covers how to go ahead and work with those ORDS modules. And I'll call them export and import and do, I'll say, the magic of being able to build and deploy those across your environments. So hopefully this is giving you a sense for what this means, but I bet you're wondering what the workflows are all about. And so in a nutshell, we'll look down here for the Oracle database and tools. You'll notice that there's a lot of other things that you might be working with within your enterprises, whether that's Oracle's BI or e-business suite or Fusion middleware or cloud-related things. That's all there as well. But very importantly, if we go here, we're going to see these reusable workflows for Apex and Friends. And so we could say, let's just take a look at a couple of these. Let's look at our definition of our workflow, this reusable workflow for Apex build. So this is our full deployment model where we have on the canvas here, this reusable workflow that was created by dragging and dropping workflow operations and plugin operations from this palette of tools over here on the right-hand side. All right, I'm going to go ahead and collapse that. If we just bring up Apex, you'll see that there are 3 operations on there to build and deploy the Apex, as well as there are some situations where you want to export the Apex applications. So that's an example where we would use that if we want to, one example where we can do CI, so continuous integration, and automatically bring your Apex applications, one or more, down into your source control system. Okay, just FYI on that. The deploy is very simple. It's a one-step deployment. We handle the under the covers, the ability to go off and deploy those, those applications, whether that's a full application or the partial, into the respective Apex database. So that's an example of a workflow that's reusable, that was built by dragging and dropping the changes onto the canvas and saved, and then you're good to go, right? So that's the Apex. We have database. So an example of database might be where we create a baseline of a baseline of a database and save all of the pertinent information away that we might need to manage that Oracle database. So I could just say, here's Oracle, and you can scan by some of these other guys, a lot of cloud-based things here, but here's the database. So we can do other things within our database plugin to compile invalid SQL statements, or do other things that we might want to do that make sense in and around managing database schemas, right? Or working with the database cloud if you're using and running your Apex applications or other database, Oracle database in the cloud, it can work there as well. So that sort of thing. Now, with not to go on a tangent, but you can just envision that for some of the technologies like eBusiness Suite, if you happen to use that type of technology, the plugins become extremely robust and allow you to do many things, building and deploying changes, some of which are database related, right? If you're familiar with eBusiness Suite, PL SQL and such are very important, so we can manage those. So the art of the possible is there, and you can go ahead and create these reusable workflows for all of the different Apex and related technologies that you might be working on together. So then at the end of the day, you get those set up and you can build and deploy all of those as applications, as projects like we're showing right here, or very importantly, you can do this as releases. So you can group these together. So now we've headed up to the release capability, and you can see that we might have a release that is Apex and the underlying Oracle database changes, and it might be using partial, so you can do the page level as well as the application level. So we can manage these together, right? And, because it's part of a solution. And so for each one of these, we created a pipeline or tied it to a pipeline. I'll show you what the simple pipeline is in a minute. So that's one example. Maybe we have an example where we've got, and that used the Oracle database plugin. Maybe we did the same thing, but we wanted to use the JDBC plugin to manage the database schema changes. So that's an option for us, right? So we create these releases to contain whatever we want them to contain. So in this one that's actually called Apex and Friends, we have a number of things. We have our Apex application. We chose the one that's going to allow us to do the page level build and deploys. But then we said, hey, we've got a bunch of other things in here. We've got some ORDS. We got those REST data services. And then we've got a few other things, right? We've got some other database-related changes that we're going to show off and use both the JDBC and the Oracle database plugin. And then here's another example where you could just execute a script, right? So flexibility there. And then on the side, maybe there's some Oracle Forms running around out there. So we have an out-of-the-box plugin for Oracle Forms as well. So you can manage all of those together, right? So that's an example of you might have a solution, a broader solution suite, you might call it an application that uses multiple technologies, tools and technologies that you want to work on together. And then very importantly, you'd tie these things to a pipeline. All right, so a pipeline, if we just edit this particular pipeline, we'll bring it up, and it basically shows the process where you have stages, test, QA, production, this sort of thing that allows you to create snapshots of the content. So for example, in this particular case, it had 5 or 6 different technologies. We'd be able to create a snapshot and versions of each one of those, so the build artifacts that are associated with them, and flow those across a pipeline that's going to govern your process. So you can do this very rapidly, create snapshots, flow them across your pipeline, inject gates wherever you see fit, such as approvals like is showing in here, and then do other things, both automated deployments, so deploy all of these 5 or 6 projects and the exact versions into the test environment. And then if it makes it there, deploy them into the QA and then into production. So it's going to flow your release content via these release snapshots across your pipeline. All right, so that's an example. I'll show you just one more example, and then we'll go ahead and execute this thing. So if we go here, we saw this is the simple pipeline, and it just shows you that you can create these reusable pipelines and tie them to your releases and do more than just approvals. You can put automated test checks in, you can put schedules in if you would like, and that sort of thing, right? So ultimately defining the process, governing the change so you can have a full continuous integration, continuous delivery, right, style process here. So you can improve really the speed of how you're doing things and then automate a lot of these steps that I would venture to guess in many cases you're doing manually or through the UI, like traditionally if you go to the Apex, the app builder, and you do an export and an import and that sort of thing. So the key is that we're able to create these release snapshots, for example, by doing something like if I do a build for this, I see that I have an opportunity to select the build of this bug tracking project, and I can go ahead and submit that and tie that to the Apex and Friends release. So I will submit the request, it'll go out and it'll perform the build, it'll run that build workflow, it'll package that up, and when it's done, it'll create a snapshot of the release. So you'll see that, okay, yes, it has, it's performing that build, that should deploy, or should complete momentarily. And when it's done, it'll check to see if it needs to create that snapshot of the release. And it's going to, because we told it to there. And then it's going to start deploying that across the pipeline. So if we go up to the release and we go up to the dashboard for Apex and Friends, you'll see that, yeah, it looks like it just it's teeing up to create that snapshot. It looks like we've got this guy waiting on here, and I'm going to just go ahead and abort that and say, you know what, we don't want that anymore, right? We don't need that to occur, and then we could go ahead and continue on with the processing of the release. So basically taking that release process, create that snapshot, and now it would basically take the content and flow it across our pipeline, right, and do that all automatically. And so for the snapshot content, that release content, we can see exactly what's running where in that snapshot. Oh, here's 2 Apex files. Here's the SCM revision number, right? We can go all the way down here. We could probably look at the supporting objects that are associated with this snapshot for the database schema changes. Oh, it looks like there's a bunch of things, some tables and views in the package body and what have you. And similarly, you could do that all the way down the road. So you have visibility to exactly what's running where. You can compare different environments and really have that traceability that we talked about earlier in the presentation. So the key is that we're going to automate the process at the project level. So whether that's the Apex application or page level, we're going to do that for the database schema changes, for ORDS, for other things that you might want to group together. A common example, I brought up the e-business suite a little earlier, and we're seeing quite a few customers that are using Apex as part of extending. So, you know, use Apex to extend the e-business suite UIs rather than using OAF. So it's a perfect example where you can do that, and you might be including that with other e-business suite related changes. just as an example. Okay, so all of that allows us to streamline that end-to-end process, and then very importantly, we have reporting, so you can have know exactly what's running where, and you can tie everything from your source control system, if you're source controlling, all the way through and across the deployment and ultimately into production for everything. And then you can slice and dice this and have file level detail of everything that's associated with your overall deployment and release process, okay? And so if I'm scrolling over here, you'll notice that it's tracking some of the things we've been deploying historically here, and then you can slice and dice this however you'd like. So for example, if we had a release that went in last night and say that it was Apex and Friends, we could subset that. We could put a window and just say what happened in the last 3 days or what happened last night, and do that, break it down however you want, and then get the file level detail as well, right? And so in this case, I mentioned the smart deployments a little earlier. This is an example where it's going to skip some of the changes that were already deployed at that specific version level. So with that said, that was a lot of material that I covered there. Hopefully you get a better sense of the art of the possible for improving your continuous integration, continuous delivery type of processes. You're heavily leveraging build and deploy and release pipelines to get that done, not only for Apex, but for some of its best friends. So I guess they're the BFFs that I guess I hear my kids talking about BFFs. So I think ORDS and database schema changes and all of those sorts of things are such friends. So hopefully you get a better sense for what that looks like and the art of the possible for how you can streamline and improve your processes. Well, let's kick this back over and take a look at what we have for questions coming in. I'm going to flip this microphone over so Rebecca and I can both.
All right, thank you, Dan. We've had a few questions come in. Just a reminder, if you guys have any questions, just go ahead and enter them in the Q&A window, and we'll just try and get through as many as we can here today. Okay, first up, Jenkins. Does FlexDeploy use Jenkins under the covers, or is it required as a separate tool for the FlexDeploy continuous integration support?
Okay, Jenkins. Okay, yeah, that's a very common question. So at the base, the answer is no, right? We have full continuous integration capability that is native to FlexDeploy, so it doesn't require Jenkins to be included. It just simplifies the problem space for those who haven't used Jenkins or Bamboo or another CI server. So that's built in, and you can do those automatic builds and deployments, i.e. CI, without Jenkins. On the other hand, some customers are using Jenkins for certain technologies, and we have integration with Jenkins. So there's a lot of flexibility there, not only for Jenkins, but for other tools that might be out there, DevOps, CI/CD tools. Clearly, there's a lot of these out there. They're capable, and our view is leverage as much as you possibly can and provide as much feature function out of the FlexDeploy platform so customers can take advantage of that. However, integrate with many, many tools across the entire tool chain.
All right, awesome. Okay, we're moving our databases to the Oracle Cloud, including the use of the autonomous database. Does FlexDeploy support Apex deployments to the cloud?
Yeah, I mentioned this briefly, but the short answer is yes. From an Apex perspective, whether you're running on-prem in the cloud or some mixed version, the support that we talked about today works, including the Oracle database plugin that I showed you and the JDBC. So we've gone through the qualification process with Oracle, specifically qualifying for running on the autonomous database. So that all works. So the short answer is everything that we looked at here works both on-prem and in the cloud, whether you're running autonomous or possibly even running some of the Oracle database running on Oracle Cloud infrastructure.
All right. Question about plugins. Are plugins supplied out of the box, or are they licensed individually?
Very briefly on how we license and price this stuff mainly on the licensing is that there's a base set of capabilities. So it's base plus plugin packs. And so the base has all of the features like build and deploy and release and all the visibility and controls. All of that, it comes with the base with some plugins, okay? And then we package up other plugin packs. So for example, in this case, we've got a plugin pack for database, and related technologies where quite a few of these particular plugins are packaged up. So that's an example. Another example is like middleware, Oracle middleware, where it has all the Fusion middleware, it has cloud platform services, or there's other things like non-Oracle middleware, or applications like eBusiness Suite or Salesforce. So basically we have different plugin packs, and all that information, by the way, is available on the website. So you can download what we call our licensing and pricing guide, and that breaks all of that down. And it's pretty clear as far as what those plugins are and what packs they're in.
All right, thanks, Dan. Okay, is this tied to specific versions of the database, Apex and ORDS? What about if Oracle changed the structures of Apex behind the scenes?
Well, boy, that's a good question. I think that would be one that I would have to follow up to get a better technical answer on. I know we verify this and test on a few different levels of the database and of ORDS and of Apex, but as to specifically what happens and how the implications for Oracle possibly changing the structure of their database as they release new versions, I have to get some more detail on how we handle those situations.
Okay. All right. If we have Oracle EBS customizations, can they be included in the same release as Apex Database and ORDS? So, for example, a report or AOL.
Yes. So we looked at that Apex and Friends and a couple others, and that showed 5 or 6 different types of technologies, i.e. FlexDeploy projects tied to those technologies, but you can include anything in a release. So it could be open source, it could be Node.js, it could be Docker and or containers that are used for microservices as an example. It could be non-Oracle related capabilities, Salesforce, MuleSoft. I mean, pick your favorite technology, commercial or open source. They all can be used and included in that release and pipeline capability that we walk through.
All right. So last question I have, unless we see more come in, we'll hang on the line in case any more come in. But this next one is, so I think I understand the JDBC project and plugin, but not sure how the Oracle database plugin works. Can you clarify how that works and whether it supports rollback?
Okay, a little more detail on that. Let's see. So basically, it takes an approach where you create a baseline environment, right? So you're going to use a baseline that you might be using Toad, or you might be using SQL Developer, but you're modeling, you're changing your baseline database, and we're going to know what that is. And then as you add columns, or as you add sequences, or as you add indexes, or I don't know how many, there's probably 20 or so object types that we support. Basically, you can say, okay, I've done this, and now I want to make my QA environment look like that, or I want to make my production environment look like that. And so we, in essence, do all of the synchronization under the covers. We generate all the DDL and everything that needs to do to synchronize those environments, and that's all done, as I said, under the covers. Now, I guess something that I think some customers find useful is that synchronization, or not synchronization, but the simulation model. Some customers want to say, okay, I want to synchronize it, but I first want part of my process to include the DBA reviewing exactly what FlexDeploy is going to do before we approve that and let it run. And so there's that simulation model that works. And so yeah, this is a big, you might call it a large functional capability, independent of just specifically with Apex, because as you would guess, I never really said it, but the Oracle database and or JDBC, those can work with any context to manage the Oracle, and with the JDBC, any other database as well. Hopefully that's helpful. I know it's still rather high level.
All right. Next question. Is it possible to build physical release packages for releasing to external customers?
Physical release packages. So what I'm thinking is maybe the question's coming from an ISV or somebody that maybe has a software product that they ship. I think if that's directionally what it is, I'll answer it this way. Well, we use FlexDeploy here at Flexagon, and as part of our process for both major releases, minor releases, fixed packs, patches, everything, we use FlexDeploy to generate all of those, including our FlexDeploy, a full version of FlexDeploy, and we generate those to run with different runtimes like Tomcat, like WebLogic. We do those that work with Oracle database because we require a database under, as a repository for FlexDeploy itself, and so we support Oracle database, Postgres, MySQL, and so I guess I'm giving these examples because we as part of our process, out the end of our process, whether it's a fixed pack or a full major new version, comes FlexDeploy and everything associated with it in a fully automated way. So it's just ready to go, right? And we do that for more traditional. We do that for containers. So we ship Docker containers, any or all of the above. And I guess if I'm understanding the question correctly, I can just talk about what we do here. And as a matter of fact, I know of other ISVs that are using FlexDeploy to do the same thing, basically to make them more effective with how they deliver not just new versions, but ongoing fixed packs or enhancements and patches and the like. Hopefully that was directionally correct in terms of the question that you asked. Anything else, Rebecca?
Wonderful. Well, that's what I have in terms of questions. So thank you, Dan, for talking with us today. Thank you all that were in attendance. As a reminder, you will be getting a recording of this webinar within the next day. We'll send it directly to you. Also, please keep an eye out for those future webinars that we mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to either Dan or myself. We'd always be happy to talk with you about it. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of your day.